Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. So in the last few episodes I've been talking about opening men to therapy and therapy to men. And this is the third part, and I'm probably going to leave this particular topic at that point and move on to something else in the next podcast. But I want to round this off because even though I'm going to finish this theme, I actually want all you listeners out there to consider this as to be a very, very important aspect if you are going to embark on any process of change. So as I said, there's some real stumbling blocks for us as men stepping into therapy or counselling or just putting our hand up for help. And I think that we need to really overcome that if we're going to embark on a process of becoming the person that we want to be, self-aware, flexible, and resilient. Now, in order to do that, it's going to take some courage to step into a space where we are going to get down and dirty, to put it bluntly. And that is that we're going to need to take off all the sort of layers that we have that seemingly protects us from any form of hurt, harm, pain, whatever you want to call it. Okay, most of us as men have been socialized in our culture to be very, very well guarded. And you can't do therapy and maintain that. It's a paradox. Stepping into therapy means leaving a space for me to be able to begin to reflect on the roles that I have and, the sort of armor that I use to protect myself in my relationships from others in the world around me. Now, let me put a few things in place here, and that is that I think therapy itself needs to become more flexible and adaptable to the issues that men face. And I think this is a real challenge for us as professionals, and partly it's because, as I've indicated earlier on, counselling and therapy has been in the Western world predominantly a female profession. When I looked at the room that I sat in my first psychology lectures, there were a lot of guys there. But by the time I graduated, it was predominantly women. There was a few of us guys. And similarly, in training as a therapist and as a counsellor, most of my colleagues were women. Now, that doesn't mean to say that I'm against, that balance in a way. I think there's some real benefits. And in fact, in some instances, I think it's really worthwhile for a lot of guys to go into therapy with a woman and to have a very different experience in that male-female relating, where there are some very clear boundaries, and those boundaries need to be established by the therapist in how the course of therapy goes, and looking at the needs of the client, the male client in that relationship. So don't get me wrong, I'm not beating up women therapists here at all. I think it's very, very important. Personally, I've also had therapy with women, and I found that extraordinarily worthwhile and helpful, both in an individual but also in a group setting. The issue that I want to drive at, though, is that there are some processes and some mental beliefs and attitudes, I think, that are often much better understood by a male to male, and the experiences that we have as males. And yes, we can argue that we are white by definition, and we are privileged by definition. But that's not always the case. I've worked with many men from different cultures, and there are some real challenges, cultural challenges in that. And that as a therapist, I found myself having to really explore that space, not just in myself and academically, but also within the space of working with that particular client. So the point that I'm making with this is, firstly, one size doesn't fit all. In fact, it's probably going to be an experience of allowing yourself to find the right person if you are looking for a therapist. Okay? And the thing that I always put out there to any new client is, look, if you're not comfortable with me, don't hesitate to tell me that, because at some point I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to open that topic up. I may not be the right person for you. It could be for lots of different reasons. It could be the size of my beard. It could be how I sound. It could be, my beliefs and my own attitudes that you've picked up on. And, that may be okay, but it may not be. And so, as the client, you have the freedom to be able to go, I need somebody else. This doesn't feel right for me. And I don't, as a therapist, take that personally. I'd rather the person be honest with me and tell me that. That's fine. There's also, and this is really, really important, many different ways in which we as therapists are trained, experienced in, and how we work. Some people talk about being eclectic, which essentially means that they pick and choose from different therapeutic models. Other people are very clear about the framework that they use in therapy, especially psychotherapy. And I make that point too, and fundamentally my framework is that of being humanistic and existential, from which I draw a lot of skills and ways of framing things from Gestalt therapy, and I'll explain that a little bit further in a few minutes. But all of us as psychologists are usually trained in cognitive behavioural therapy. And although to me it's not so much necessarily a therapy but a set of tools, and yes, some of you out there are going to take me to task on that, and that's okay, it focuses much, much more on action, in my view, getting people to do the right things in terms of their thinking and their actions, than it does necessarily exploring what I call the dynamics of their being. Okay, so for example, I don't dwell with a client on the past, but I need to have a clear understanding and help them to understand their past and how it's impacted on them and what it's doing for them right here and now, and giving them an opportunity to reflect on that and becoming aware of having different choices. I don't necessarily need to behave the same way all the time simply because there's the same set of triggers. And to me, a lot of the process is about, meeting my needs and how I thwart from meeting my needs. In other words, what am I doing that stops me from feeling safe and secure and content in myself, in my relationship with myself? Because sure enough, my inner inadequacies or doubts or criticisms, I'm going to more than likely project onto the people around me in some form. And unfortunately, it is true that we often treat the ones we love worse than we treat strangers. And part of the reason for that is that, in my view, projection of my own stuff in my relationship with myself. Now, if I'm super critical of myself, I'm going to be super critical about my partner or my kids. I'm not going to be as controlled in my behaviour as I would be with strangers. I'm just going to let it go out. And, in that space, we can do an extraordinary amount of damage, as we've spoken about. A lot of, about our well-being psychologically and physically is the capacity to form a safe and secure attachment. Now, initially, that comes through our relationships with our caregivers, and then as we mature and become adults, it's the core of my attachment to myself. So I don't need to use, a funky group of defense mechanisms to keep myself feeling okay. And we can go into that in another podcast about what they are exactly. So this is now a really important aspect of the framing of therapy is, if you're doing stuff to others, the chances are you're doing stuff to yourself. And a lot of it is not helpful, it's not pleasant, and in fact, a lot of times it's destructive. So we need to explore that and we need to take it further. Hence my view about, therapy, yes, is there to meet, and help a person with the immediate problems, so if that's anxiety or depression. And, cognitive behavioral therapy is very, very useful in creating some change in that space. But a lot of times, we're also looking for a deeper change, a change at the core of self, okay? So we're coming back to that idea about self-awareness and connection. And the other part is that whole bit about flexibility and adaptability. How do I, encounter the people around me and the world that I live in, that I occupy in a healthier way, in order to become more resilient. Now, the element in that, is to be authentic. So one of the things that I try as much as possible to help my clients with is the capacity to get to that point where they authentically express what's going on in their inner world without a mask, without, pretenses, without, censorship. And a lot of times we actually don't have that space in our day-to-day relationships where we can necessarily do that without a fear of censure. Now, sometimes it's an anxiety. Sometimes that threat actually doesn't exist out there, but it exists in our own head. Usually, possibly, because we've had experiences in our past that have taught us to be extraordinarily cautious and self-protective in that space. Now, I worked with, as I've said in a previous podcast, with a guy called George Rosner, who was an amazing therapist. He was a Gestalt therapist. He was one of Fritz Perl's students, and he took over working in therapy and then becoming a teacher. And I did a masterclass with him, which was extraordinarily enlightening, and it was really, really valuable to me. And he wrote a book called Peeling the Onion, and it's a central metaphor in his work. And essentially, it's about Gestalt theory and methodology, and everyone might be turning their eyes back in their head. It ain't that complicated, folks. Okay. The important bit with that whole thing is that we engage in the process of self-discovery through identifying 5 layers in a continuum of awareness. Now, they're actually quite straightforward. So the first layer is called the cliche layer, right? And it's a bit like, think of being at a party and you're engaged in small talk with someone you've just met. It's a safe and non-threatening way of getting to know someone, small talk. Now, interestingly, some of us are really good at small talk and others are not, okay? And it's an integral part of social interaction, but unfortunately, some of us get stuck there. I often see that with a lot of boys and men, where much of their communication revolves around sport and media and gaming. And a lot of dads that I work with struggle with relating both to their partner, but also to their kids on the emotional basis of the relationship. And so they resort to the next layer, which is that of being in a role. So I'm a father, I'm a carpenter, a doctor, a lawyer, whatever it is. It's what we do to make a living, generally speaking. and something that adds meaning to our lives and how we define ourselves in our society. Our role at any given moment is how we want to be seen by others. And it also is something that we can hide behind to use as a kind of social armour. And when this particular layer is challenged, either through economic or age-related reasons, many of us as men experience a profound loss wherein our identity is diminished. The question of who am I becomes central to the conversation. So you're now picking up that I'm moving myself and my client through these layers. Now, I don't want people to think about them as good or bad, okay? Take the binary stuff out of it. The following layer is what's called the phobic layer. And here, it's in this space that we hold our deepest fears and often conceal what's behind our role layer. It is, if we're going to grow, essential to know our fears. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to be masters of our own fate. Now, as we descend through the phobic layer, if you want to look at it that way, then we hit the impasse. And this is the layer of growth and self-discovery. This is where we come face to face with our fears, begin to overcome them, or at least form some kind of truce or alliance in ourselves. When we can penetrate this layer, we begin to gain access to our own greatness, because this layer opens the door to our core, to who we truly are at any moment. Now, when we reach the core, it's in this space that we encounter our true emotions, our real response to the world at any given instant. And so, in a final wrap, it is the place wherein we experience ourselves as authentic. Now, if I structure it a bit, the first three layers in Gestalt therapy are called the constructed self. That's how we armour ourselves and result in a way in restricting body awareness, a lower level of self-awareness, inhibited emotional expression, acquired narcissism, and a deeper pathology that results in a lack of flexibility and therefore adaptability. And finally, it is the place wherein we have restricted our resilience. Now, this is maintained until we have the courage to deconstruct ourselves by entering the impasse. This is essential before we can address what Pearls refers to as the deadness at our core. Often I ask people, what are you feeling? And they go, I don't know. And so that is, it's not something to be scared of, it's something to begin to explore. It is therein that we descend into that authentic space. It's also the experience which is fundamental in being present in our relationships, especially in the therapist-client relationship and our personal, intimate relationships. So, as a therapist, I'm here to shed a light on the journey into this in a meaningful ways for the person to become better at experiencing themselves. So the idea that therapy is a process of self-discovery as much as it is about a healing journey of past traumas and wounds, that idea is not new. But what we need to think about is how this is absolutely fundamentally relevant to begin to understand the influence our socializations had on our being. And that's an important aspect. So some heady food for thought. I hope for those of you seeking therapy are going to find this useful. It certainly, when I've shared this with others, has made quite a lot of difference for them, especially the idea that you're not going to hit it off with the first therapist. And yep, it's going to take a bit of work, and it is going to be ultimately a fruitful experience and not just about feeling less anxious or less depressed or less OCD or whatever it is that the presenting problem is. It's a broader experience than that. So, I want to just wrap it by saying that therapy needs to challenge not simply our personal perceptions, behaviours, choices, values, and beliefs. I think it needs to help us as men critically reflect on the whole gamut of things, our social fabric, the systems that we have in place. I know working with lots of men, a large amount of pain comes from status anxiety, and this is a core issue, and we need to unravel that. For further information, don't hesitate to look up my book, Surfing the New Masculinity, Making Good Men Great, Surfing the New Masculinity is the complete title. It's available on Amazon and all the various online bookstores, and this will flesh it out a little bit more. For those of you who don't want to read it, just stick around for more podcasts. So until next time, have a good journey.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.